Right now, you might be drinking coffee. Or you just had one this morning. You didn't think twice about it. Wake up, make coffee, drink coffee, the most normal routine in the world. But for most of human history, nobody had ever heard of it. And the first time the world saw coffee, people thought it was demonic. So when did it start? When did humans first start drinking coffee? The story starts in the highlands of Ethiopia, probably around the 9th century. A goat herd named Kaldi noticed his goats were acting strange. They were dancing, full of energy, refusing to sleep after eating red berries from a certain bush. He tried the berries himself and felt the same electric alertness. A monk nearby saw this, called it the devil's work, and threw the berries into the fire. But the smell that came off that fire, the first roasted coffee in human history, was intoxicating. The monk pulled the roasted beans from the embers, ground them, mixed them with hot water, and drank the world's first cup of coffee. Did this actually happen? Probably not. There's no contemporary record of Kaldi, but the story survived for 1,000 years because it captures something true. The discovery of coffee was accidental, and it was powerful enough that people needed a myth to explain it. The real history is more precise. The first confirmed coffee drinkers weren't Ethiopian goat herds. They were Sufi monks in Yemen, around the 15th century. The Sufis had a problem. Their religious practice required long night prayers, and staying awake was difficult. Someone discovered that a drink made from the roasted beans of a certain plant, imported from across the Red Sea from Ethiopia, could keep you alert for hours without the intoxication of alcohol. Coffee became known as the wine of Islam. Because Islam forbids alcohol, coffee filled a void. It was the drink that kept you awake, clear-headed and focused. Everything alcohol was not. By the 16th century, the port of Mecca in Yemen was exporting coffee across the entire Islamic world, from Istanbul to Cairo to Mecca to Persia. The word mocha still means coffee to this day. Coffee houses appeared everywhere, in Mecca, Cairo, Istanbul, Damascus. They were called schools of wisdom. People gathered, drank, talked, argued, played chess, listened to music, discussed politics. It was the first time in human history that people had a public space where they could sit for hours for the price of a single cup, and that made the authorities nervous. In 1511, the governor of Mecca banned coffee. His reasoning? It was intoxicating, therefore forbidden by the Quran. Coffee was publicly burned. Coffee drinkers were beaten in the streets. But the ban lasted only a few years. The people wanted coffee too badly. The Ottoman Sultan eventually lifted the ban and declared coffee sacred. This pattern would repeat itself across the world for the next 400 years. In 1615, Venetian merchants brought the first coffee beans to Europe. For decades, the Arab world had maintained a near-total monopoly on coffee production. They boiled the beans before export to prevent them from germinating. Every coffee bean in the world came from Yemen. The Venetians called it the devil's drink. The Catholic Church demanded Pope Clement VIII ban it outright. But Clement VIII did something unexpected. He tasted it first. And according to contemporary accounts, he said, "This devil's drink is so delicious that we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." Coffee was now officially Christian. Venice's first coffee house opened in 1645. Oxford followed in 1650. By 1700, London had over 300 coffee houses. The Arab monopoly finally broke when the Dutch smuggled a coffee plant out of Yemen in 1616 and began cultivating it in Ceylon and Java. Within decades, the world's coffee supply would no longer depend on a single port. Those 300 coffee houses changed the world. They were called penny universities. For the price of a penny cup of coffee, you could stay all day and argue about politics, science, philosophy, and literature with strangers from every class of society. Isaac Newton dissected a dolphin on a coffeehouse table in 1665. Adam Smith finished The Wealth of Nations in a coffeehouse. The London Stock Exchange began at Jonathan's Coffee House. But the most explosive coffeehouse was in Paris. In 1789, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins stood on a table at the Café de Foy and called the people of Paris to arms. The crowd poured into the streets. 3 days later, they stormed the Bastille. The French Revolution was fueled by coffee, literally. But Europe's addiction to coffee had a dark side that is still with us. Coffee only grows in tropical climates, and Europe had none. So colonial powers established massive coffee plantations across the global south, the Caribbean, Central and South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. The Dutch introduced coffee to Java in the 1690s, the origin of Java as slang for coffee. The French brought it to Martinique in 1714, one single coffee plant from the botanical garden of Amsterdam, shipped across the Atlantic. That one plant became the ancestor of millions of coffee trees across the Americas. The Portuguese brought it to Brazil. By the 1820s, Brazil was producing nearly half the world's coffee, and none of it was produced by free labor. Brazil alone imported over 4 million enslaved Africans. Many were worked to death on coffee plantations. Haiti's coffee and sugar plantations were so brutal that the enslaved population revolted in 1791, the only successful slave revolt in history. One crop created the wealth of Europe and the suffering of 3 continents. At the same time, back in Europe, coffee was quietly becoming the drink of the Industrial Revolution. Factory shifts required steady attention for 12 to 14 hours. Alcohol made you slow, coffee made you alert. Employers started providing free coffee to workers, not out of kindness, but because it increased productivity. The modern concept of the coffee break was invented by employers to keep workers going through long shifts. Coffee and capitalism grew up together. Then came the 20th century. In World War I, instant coffee was included in every American soldier's ration kit. The U.S. military shipped over 5 million pounds of it overseas. A generation of soldiers returned home hooked. Starbucks opened its first store in Seattle in 1971. By 2023, it had over 38,000 locations worldwide. Coffee went from a morning ritual to a lifestyle identity. Today, coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world after oil. 2.25 billion cups are consumed every day. The global industry is worth over $200 billion. But the structure hasn't changed in 500 years. The countries that grow coffee are still the ones that used to be colonies. The countries that consume the most are the ones that used to be colonizers. The coffee you buy for $5 is made from beans sold by farmers who earn less than $2 a day for their entire harvest. The system built 500 years ago is still running. So here's where we are. A 9th century Ethiopian goatherd whose goats started dancing. The Sufi monks who drank the wine of Islam to stay awake for prayer. The Ottoman Sultan who banned it, the Pope who baptized it, the Venetian merchants who smuggled it, the revolutionaries who planned the fall of a monarchy over it, the enslaved people who died producing it, the factory owners who used it to keep workers awake, and the global corporation that sells it to you today. Kaldi didn't know what he'd found that day in the Ethiopian highlands. The goats didn't know they were changing human history. That first Sufi monk who brewed a cup at midnight for a prayer he didn't want to fall asleep through, he couldn't have known that his little ritual would become the daily habit of billions. They just found something that made them feel awake. And they wanted more. The rest is history, and the next time you take a sip of coffee without thinking, you're drinking 1,200 years of it.